תהלך בארץ בתרמיל ובמקל, וודאי תפגוש בדרך שוב את ארץ ישראל. יחבקו אותך דרכיך.
Hi, it's Aryeh Green again. Welcome to Tales of the Trail, our weekly radio broadcast and video program about hiking the Israel Trail and meeting personal challenges. If you're tuning in now for the first time, you should know that there is an introductory segment which you can see on the Melitz website or here on Melitz Radio, which gives a bit of context for each of these weekly segments. And this is our second segment, having introduced the story, as it were, of my hike along the Israel Trail, 8 weeks, all by myself at age 51, immediately following my divorce, where I basically got out on the trail to both reconnect with our ancestors, our shared history, and the people of Israel, the land of Israel, and also to have a bit of time for myself and to find ways and look for ways to heal from what was a very difficult personal situation lasting a number of years. We're now actually just beginning the process in this series of radio programs of walking through the different sections of the Israel Trail, and our intention is to go with each segment through 1 week of the trip. And what I will be sharing with you are some of the experiences themselves and some of the thoughts and lessons that I learned while hiking the trail. And I will stick in a few videos and a few photos to help give a feel. So I hope you'll enjoy walking the trail with me, as it were. Oh, and by the way, that's one of the reasons we're doing this now in the corona situation we're in now, with all of us, or many of us, confined to our homes or limited in our ability to travel. So the idea of walking the trail, even virtually, with me, hopefully is a bit of a welcome respite from the challenges of trying to live something of a normal life in this new normal of the corona world that we live in. And so we decided, Radio Melitz and me, to host these segments in different outdoor settings. So last week I was here in my garden. I am again now on the second segment in my garden. You can see behind me, or I think you can see, the vines in my home vineyard. I have 21 vines. You can see even crawling up the wall there, some of the vines, and here are some of the shorter ones that just now came into blossom just as we were beginning to film last week. And I think this might be a nice way to enjoy the time that we have together with the swing in the backyard, and hopefully there won't be too many bugs. But if you watched the first or listened to the first segment of the program, you'll know that the idea here is to have something of an informal chat. This is not a formal presentation, but within the context of the half an hour that we'll be able to spend together, I hope I'll be able to give you a little bit of not just a good feeling for different aspects of the trail and the hike itself, but as I said, some of those lessons that I learned along the way. So I think a great place to start is, well, at the beginning. This segment is called Desert Humility, which is reflected in the first 2 chapters of my book, My Israel Trail, which most of these recollections and the lessons are obviously based on, and they're fleshed out more in the book itself. But starting at the beginning means starting in Eilat. And I remember very well those first few steps, where you'll see a photo here in a second, of leaving behind the tourist area of the hotels at the bottom of Nachal Shlomo, of Wadi Shlomo, of Solomon's Valley, and heading up into the Eilat Hills and the Eilat Mountains. What was really interesting about that first day was, well, on the one hand, this immediate feeling of quiet, of silence, and of loneliness as well, and a recognition of being on my own. I remember turning around after the first maybe half a kilometer or so and seeing my friend Svi, who had waved me off in the distance, kind of watching, and I so much wanted to turn around and head back to him, but I knew that this was something that I really needed to do, wanted to do, in terms of hiking the trail as a personal challenge. But I remember that wistful feeling, and I suppose that's something that we all feel sometimes when we start on a journey, and we're not quite sure where it's going to lead, and we're not sure if it's the right thing to do, or we're not sure if it's going to be easy, or we're sure it's going to be hard, difficult, and you get that feeling of maybe I shouldn't do this, maybe I should turn back. In this case, it was very, very tempting to go back to the comfort of a hotel in Eilat, but I got through that initial hesitation and made my way up Nachal Shlomo, Wadi Shlomo. And after a number of hot hours, which included a little bit of, actually very unusual for that area, light rain on the first day that I was out, I found myself at the meeting of two different trails. And it was about 3 p.m, and I felt that I wasn't really ready to hike up one trail, which was going to be maybe 45 minutes to get to the night camp. And I had read and then read again in the trail guide, it's called the Red Guide, the official trail guide for hiking, unofficial, but the most popular guide to hiking the Israel Trail, that it would be a shame to miss the breathtaking views from the top of Har Shlomo, of Mount Solomon. If any of you have ever been to the Eilat Mountains, if you've done any walking around the area, you may actually be familiar with, perhaps even have visited, the brown and black and gray and light brown hills overlooking Eilat. And you may know that really the views are quite stunning, seeing the shimmering water in the distance of the Gulf of Eilat, reaching out into the Red Sea, of course. So the book suggested that if you have time, you really ought to climb up and see this view. It was 3 p.m, it's February 16th, 2014, and I kind of shrugged and felt, why not? Now, there are some things, actually, as an aside, but a very integral part of this story that you may not know about those of us who make Aliyah, move to Israel, and I did so 35 years ago, as far as the hike is concerned, 30 years previously. And being a fluent Hebrew speaker, you'd think that these kind of things wouldn't happen that often, but I guess they don't happen that often, but when they do, they sometimes have unusual repercussions. So as a fluent Hebrew speaker, I can speak everyday Hebrew, and in my own field, business, government sector, education, the media, there are specific terms that I'm very familiar with, as you can imagine, as anybody would be in terms of their own personal spheres of interest. Well, my eye kind of glanced at the description of this hike up to Har Shlomo, to the top of Har Shlomo, and I didn't really register a particular Hebrew word, which, because hiking, although I had hiked, as I mentioned in the introduction, quite a bit with my kids over the years, here in Israel too, not really a professional hiker, so the vocabulary of hiking was not something that I necessarily was that familiar with. The word that I missed in reading the recommendation by the Israel Trails author, the book, the guide's author to hike up Har Shlomo, was the word tlula. Tlula ma'od, in fact, and those of you who aren't Hebrew speakers, I'll translate. The word is steep, very steep. I missed that, which became one of the first lessons I learned on the trail. Check the topography on the map before you decide to take, for instance, a diversion, or even just in planning the day's hike. I found myself, remember, this is the first day out on my trek, which, again, I'm not going to repeat everything in the introduction, but it was something that for me was a new experience, the idea of a long trek. I was an avid day hiker with a day backpack, sometimes an overnight camp out or a backpack. But this kind of an extended trek was not something that I was necessarily all that prepared for. And this was the first day out with a 50-pound pack on my back at age 51 in the heat and then light rain, as I said, of these Eilat mountains. I found myself climbing up the side of this mountain. Boulders, literally without exaggerating, almost as high as tall as I am. Hand over hand. At one point, I wrote this in my journal that night. I felt like I was Frodo climbing into Mount Doom, but I didn't have any Sam. If you're familiar with the story of the Lord of the Rings, Frodo's sidekick, his helpmeet, his helper and assistant, is Samwise Gamgee. I had no Sam to help me to carry my pack, or to carry me as Sam did in the end, carrying Frodo up Mount Doom. And I'm smiling now, and I enjoy telling the story, but it was excruciatingly difficult. So much so that at one point, halfway up the mountain, and as it was beginning to turn to dusk, and I was realizing a little bit frightening that I might not make it to my night camp, where I had left some water previously to pick up for the next day, and which is a protected area. You're not allowed to camp out other than in a designated night camp. And treacherous cliffside paths were not something that I really wanted to try and make my way across in the midst of dusk or even darkness. So at one point, halfway up this mountainside, as I said, climbing hand over hand with this 50-pound pack on my back, I basically sat down and took out my phone. And I was about to call my son up in Jerusalem to call the emergency services, to call 669, the IDF search and rescue team, to send a helicopter and get me off the side of this bloody mountain, because I was really concerned. And I was saying to myself, I didn't sign up for a challenge course. I wasn't looking to prove anything in terms of the ability to achieve some particular physical goal of so many kilometers a day or such and such elevation or what have you. This was not that sort of a personal challenge. The idea that I had to hike the Israel Trail was to get out, to change the environment that I was in, to find a way to kind of deal with, to handle, and to heal from the pain and the suffering that I was undergoing, having literally just before setting out on the Israel Trail, given my wife the divorce that she had asked for. And I took my phone out and I started to dial my son's number. And I put the phone down and I said to myself, Aryeh, you're on the side of a mountain and you're alone. And this was your choice. Now, maybe you made a mistake, and that's a lesson to learn. Learn from your mistakes. Don't necessarily do everything the Red Guide says. Don't take a diversion off the trail which you don't know enough about yet to make an informed decision. But mistakes or otherwise, this is your reality. You're on the side of a mountain, and you're alone, and you have to deal with that. You have to evaluate your options, now make a good decision, having made a bad decision, figure out what makes sense in terms of the next steps, but nobody's going to save you. I mean, I laugh about the joke of calling my son and calling 669, the 669 unit, because it is a laugh line. They wouldn't send a helicopter out just to pick up some old geezer on the side of a hill, unless, of course, he was injured or starving or dehydrated, none of which was the case. But for me, it was a pivotal moment on that first day of the trek where I recognized that I have to take charge of the situation I find myself in. And that night, skipping ahead through a number of different experiences, but I did make it to the night camp that evening. And I wrote in my journal, as it was raining again outside, and I was inside my tent. Thank God that I had brought the tent, which I thought of not bringing because it was so heavy. Not expecting to have rain, certainly not in the first day and in the midst of the hills of Eilat. Later in Jerusalem, you'll hear, if you follow along with the later segments, I was rained on quite a bit. But in the tent that night, I wrote in my journal, um, I guess the first lesson that really I learned while walking the trail, which was a matter of accepting the reality that we find ourselves in. And I remember writing in the journal, you're divorced. This is your reality. It's something that I had never anticipated, never expected. It was not my choice, and nor was it something that I necessarily... I'm not saying that there's anything wrong, of course, with divorce itself. Many marriages, many relationships need to end, and people need to separate. In my case, it wasn't something, as I said, that was my choice, and I certainly didn't feel that it was necessary. But on a larger level, it was not a position I expected to find myself in. Even back in high school, college, I was kind of a long-term relationship type of a person, and becoming more observant in terms of my religiosity, my spiritual outlook towards the institution, as it were, of marriage. It was something that I was pretty committed to in terms of making the effort to make it work. And so I wrote in my journal that night, this is your reality. You didn't expect to find yourself divorced at age 51. And what was fascinating at that point was connecting these dots. Just like you had to face the reality that you had made a mistake and climbed up the side of a wrong mountain and you were alone and nobody was going to come and save you. You have to, at this point, reach a level of acceptance of this reality that you're facing in order to be able to try and make some decisions as to what are the next steps to make in your life. So that first lesson for me was instrumental in getting me to the point where I could feel even some semblance of hope and optimism for the future. It was coupled with, and I called this first segment desert humility, because a great part of that acceptance has to do with a certain understanding of my position in the world, of my status. It's not just an issue of modesty. The humility that I'm talking about came from a number of different places, one of which was finding myself alone in the midst of the desert silence, as it were. And my understanding that I had left everything behind, that my children didn't need me, grown up young adults, in one of them married, the other two working. My office didn't need me. I had taken a leave of absence and found somebody to run the organization while I was gone. My folks, my brother, my friends didn't need me. I was free, as it were. Obviously, my wife, former wife, didn't need me. But it wasn't just a question of freedom. It was a question of really being alone, not in the sense of loneliness, but alone in the sense of being on my own, and not having the kind of responsibilities that usually we have at age 51, let's say, with 3 kids and a job and a mortgage to pay and what have you. Now, I'm sure that many of you listening or watching can imagine that as daunting as that might be, you can't see me if you're listening to the radio, but I'm swatting away at the mosquitoes in the garden here in the early evening. On the one hand, that kind of aloneness could have been very lonely and daunting and overwhelming. And I'll share with you some video of my walking in the desert alone, surrounded by a lot of mountains, different colors and expanses and dry riverbeds, and you can hear how and see and feel how quiet it really is. And some of the photos that I'm sharing also give you a feel of the expansiveness, and that expansiveness of the desert gives you a feeling of smallness. And again, that could be overwhelming, that could be daunting and unpleasant. But for me, it was in a weird way liberating. It made me feel that I was part of something bigger, part of a wider universe, that on the one hand could obviously get along without me, not just my family, friends, and work, but the universe can get along without me. But on the other hand, it made me feel that I was part of a wider universe. And in the next segment, perhaps, I'll talk a bit about the issue of connecting with our forefathers, with our ancestors, with the Jewish people, as they wandered through the desert. But here I want to focus on this sense of humility, because in a certain way, I say it was liberating. What I mean is it was uplifting. It made me feel that even though I may be alone, I'm not necessarily alone, as it were, in the universe. In fact, I had a wonderful play on words, which I'm sure somebody before me made up before I discovered it. It was kind of a fun combination of the word aloneness. If you add an L and divide the words into three, all oneness, the idea of being alone in this environment, surrounded by the silence of the desert, made me feel that I was one with the universe, as it were, as kind of hyperbole as that is. But having said that, the combination of this sense of connection with the rest of the universe, but smallness, put my issues in perspective. It was the suffering, the pain that I had been feeling and continued to feel, anger and resentment. How could this have happened to me? Anger at God, anger, of course, and sadness at my former wife for the decision that she took, which, as I mentioned in the introduction, was her right to take as an adult person. Obviously, that wasn't the issue. The issue is that I was not something that I would have chosen. But the feelings that I was dealing with, pain and suffering, what have you, when put into a perspective, a historical perspective and a universal perspective, instead of making me feel small and worthless, it made me feel that it was something that I could manage. And that's the connection also to being on the side of the mountain there. Being on the side of Har Shlomo and accepting that that was my reality, and that night writing in the journal that I needed to accept the reality that I was now divorced, connected with the fact that there are many, many issues that we as human beings suffer from. And this is one of them, and I'm not one to compare different kinds of suffering or pain, but I certainly recognize that this was the kind of suffering or pain that could be dealt with, and that part of dealing with it would entail my both understanding that perspective and reaching a level of acceptance that this is my reality, and that therefore I would be able to move on from there if I did so. And that kind of summarizes that first day in leaving Eilat. And I will say that the next few days, and I'm happy to share a few more photos of the next day in Canyon Shechoret, and then heading up to Ma'ale Amram, one of the steepest ascents. And yes, now I recognized that word in the trail guide as I prepared for the next day or the next few days. Those days, those first 3 days, really served to reinforce both of those lessons that I've shared with you now: the importance of humility and the significance of this kind of an acceptance. And I remember thinking, I read about this a little bit in the book, how Jewish these ideas are, how much our Masoret, how our tradition, and our leaders and our forefathers and mothers demonstrated incredible levels of both humility and acceptance. So, for instance, Moshe Rabbeinu is known for his sterling character trait, which our sages say was specifically why he was chosen to be the leader of the children of Israel, to lead us to our freedom was because of his humility, his modesty. He was anav. We understand that from all the sources. And it was his sense of not worthlessness, but his sense of his lack of stature that lent authority, apparently, to him, and that is the reason that God chose him to lead the Jewish people. And he's, of course, not the only one. And the issue of acceptance is something that I've always marveled at the response of Aaron, Moshe's brother, when he's informed of the death of his two sons for bringing what was called in the biblical narrative strange fire that God had not commanded to be brought to the altar. The Torah says, Vaidom Aaron, and Aaron stood silent. And that has always amazed me, the power and the strength of those few words, which our sages talk about a level of acceptance, that we, even without understanding why, where the decision came from, where God sent fire down from heaven to consume, to kill Aaron's two sons, the strength of character that it demonstrates to simply accept, this is my lot, this is what's happening, this is my reality, and I just have to deal with it. Those are just some of the kind of background or thoughts that I had while hiking through those days, which reinforced in me these ideas of acknowledging the reality. What's that pithy aphorism about? God, give me the strength, give me the understanding, or to accept the things to accept the things I cannot change, to change the things I can, and the wisdom to know the difference. I think that really does kind of sum up the issue of the importance of our ability to accept the reality that we're given. This third part of that aphorism of accepting, or the wisdom to know the difference between accepting the things that I cannot change. That doesn't mean we shouldn't work to obviously change things that we can. But when we can't, when we're faced with the reality that we can't change, then that acceptance becomes obviously so very significant. So that's kind of a taste of the first kind of segment, that first week on the trail. And I think we're running out of time a little bit. So I'm just going to check our time signal here and wind down with a little hint of what'll come next. I want to share in the next segment a few more videos talking about the silence of the desert, and I'll leave you with another thought of about humility and acceptance in the next segment. So thank you for watching and for joining me on my journey on my Israel Trail. And thank you to Melitz Radio for hosting us. See you next time.
להתהלך בארץ בתרמיל ובמקל, וודאי תפגוש בדרך שוב את ארץ ישראל. יחבקו אותך דרכיה של הארץ הטובה, היא תקרא אותך אליה כמו אל ארץ אהבה.